the TeachPitch podcast. We are very excited to be launching a series of interviews for TeachPitch, a global community of 50,000 subscribers from over 205 countries to date. And for these interviews, we have selected a number of subscribers who have achieved great things. And by great, I mean amazing. Think of former presidents, entrepreneurs, people who've built hospitals, huge non-profit organizations, successful journalists, doctors, etc. And what all our guests have in common is that despite their great success, they've encountered many enormous challenges. So what were these challenges and how did they overcome them? That's what we're going to be talking about here. My name is Aldo and I'm massively looking forward and very grateful you can join us on this journey. So sit back, relax and download the podcast here.
How do you take what was seen as primarily a local concern and elevate it into one that's globally significant?
Global way.
Yep. Yeah. So it's almost like how do you make the reverse journey, right?
The other way around.
How do you get business people interested in education, for example, right? How do you get them interested beyond complaining that they can't find, enough employees with the right skills? Because usually the interests of business kind of tends to stop there.
In this interview, we talk to our guest about the challenge of running an organization with a global aspiration to build the future of education into clear, tangible objectives in such a way that everyone is able to follow its mission and actions. We speak about how you can use local solutions as fitting answers to global questions and problems. And lastly, we talk about how impact can best be felt and measured when building a social enterprise with so many programs and activities that benefit the global state of education. Enjoy this interview with Stavros Yiannouka, CEO of the World Innovation Summit for Education. Every other year, the beautiful cosmopolitan city of Doha opens its doors to those who shake and make education in this world. From all over the globe, people fly in to discuss the latest innovative developments, brightest ideas and best practices to improve the process of teaching and learning every step of the way. Policymakers, scientists, entrepreneurs, writers, teachers and most importantly students join together to exchange their thoughts on how we can collectively move forward with education in its core. The World Innovation Summit for Education, hosted by the Qatar Foundation under the patronage of Her Royal Highness Sheikha Mozha Bint Nasser, is a fully immersive experience that one is not soon to forget. This summit really allows relevant stakeholders and enthusiasts to interact through a series of thoughtful workshops, lunch-ons, fireside chats, panel discussions and lectures that dive deep into the educational problems at hand. While at the same time, it has also managed to attract a lot of star power, enjoying the presence and speakership of many members of royal houses, heads of state and incredibly impressive people like CNN's Fareed Zakaria, Michelle Obama and even Shakira. The pièce de résistance of this biannual summit is the WISE Prize, an award of $500,000 given to people who have dedicated their lives to positively changing this world through education. The summit always allows me to recharge my batteries, and when stepping back on a plane homeward to the United Kingdom, I'm fully inspired, ready to take on the challenges that teachers all over the world have to cope with. WISE, its objective is to connect innovators in such a way that they are encouraged to collaborate, so together they can realize educational transformations where needed. And the summit is just the mere beginning of all of this. The WISE Accelerator, the WISE Awards, the WISE Emerging Leaders Program, a WISE Words podcast, the list goes on and on and on. The mastermind behind WISE in its most recent form is its CEO, Stavros Yiannouka, who with his warm and personable approach makes sure this event, as well as the many other ongoing activities of the platform, are a success. Before joining WISE in 2012, Stavros was the Executive Vice Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. a strategy consultant at McKinsey & Company, and before that practiced corporate law for a variety of law firms in London. In a 2020 Forbes article, Stavros rightly so expressed his concerns over the effects of the pandemic, specifically on education, urging all those involved to look beyond tomorrow. Education needed fundamental changes before COVID-19, states Stavros, and it needs it even more now. It's still within our power to make it happen, but if we don't look beyond simply being resilient, we'll certainly never get there. Definitely a lot to talk about. Stavros, a very warm welcome to you.
Thank you, Aldo. Good to be here. Good to see you.
Stavros, before we officially start with this interview, I just wanted to say that you are one of the most patient and most graceful guests that we've had thus far on the Teach Pitch podcast. I've interviewed now around 25 or so people, and you were one of the very first people I got to interview. So thank you for that. Thank you for believing in this podcast program. But then also your belief in what we were doing was somewhat tested because at the very first time that we spoke, I forgot to click the record button. And so we had an entire conversation, which was very nice.
Very good conversation.
A very good conversation, very informative. I was very proud of myself.
Lost to the world now.
Correct. Lost to the world. I did not click record. Now, you would say that I would have learned my lesson, and I thought I did. So you were gracious enough to grant us another hour of your time for another interview. So we did that again. And this time I did click record. The interview was stored, but then when we wanted to get to editing the interview, the recording was gone. So I was very fearful. I felt very ashamed, saying, oh my goodness, I cannot possibly ask Stavros and his team again to do the interview a third time. But there you were, again saying absolutely no problem. And that means a lot. Thank you very much, Stavros. So here's to a third time of doing this interview. Take 3 of the Teach Pitch podcast. But thanks a lot for doing that. That means a lot for the podcast, for Teach Pitch. And we're going to make it worth your while, most definitely.
No worries, Aldo. You're very welcome. And, as someone who dabbles in podcasting and, had a bumpy start as well, I'm totally empathetic to all the mishaps that can take place, and just happy to be doing this again. Always happy to chat.
Thank you so much. And let's start there, because Wise Words, I think it's an enormously informative podcast program. You talk to educators and policymakers in education from all over the world. I've had the privilege of being a guest there, which was great. Could you tell me a bit more about Wise Words and where you are taking this?
So we've been around now since the end of 2017. So in fact, we recorded our very first episodes during the 2017 Wise Summit, and we were very privileged to have people like Fareed Zakaria, Chimamanda Adichie, the author, and Kishore Mahbubani, my former boss and mentor and good friend from Singapore, be some of the very first guests on the podcast. And we've recorded now, I think we're up to about 70 or so long form interview episodes, not dissimilar to what you're doing with Teach Pitch. In fact, later today, we're going to record an episode with Shannon May of what used to be Bridge International and is now New Globe, to really talk about their experience of dealing with COVID across a number of different African countries. So it's a resource. It's available wherever people get their podcasts. We also stream increasingly episodes live on Facebook, so people can find us there as well. Where we're going with it in the future is, I think, perhaps more thematically structured episodes, around a subject matter. And we experimented with this, at the beginning of this year, where we recorded series of podcasts on post-pandemic priorities for education, and spoke to influential people and thinkers from different countries and regions of the world. And in fact, the episode with Shannon is really the capstone of that series. talking about Africa. You might say maybe we're a little premature in declaring the post-pandemic era, but one way or another it will be upon us.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Please declare it, Stavros. Please declare it. I'm ready for post-pandemic era. Wishful thinking. Thank you. And thank you for talking about wise words. If you haven't listened to it already, I could highly recommend it. Before we get to your challenges, I want to go back to the very beginning. And I want to go back to when you joined Wise as a CEO and get a little bit of an idea of, what the world was like back then, and particularly what, to your idea, the state of education was like. And if possible, I would like to dive into, where you saw a need for the platform that is the World Innovation Summit for Education, when this journey started for you.
Yeah. So that was almost exactly 9 years to the day that I arrived in Doha with my family to take on the role of CEO of Wise. And I find it hard to look back without coloring my view of the past with what I know, has transpired since. So what you had then was Wise was already quite a successful event. It had hosted 3 summits, 2009, 10, and 11, and was about to host its 4th summit in 2012, within a few months of me sort of showing up to take on the role. And of course, Wise was and is the brainchild of Qatar Foundation, and in particular the chairperson, Her Highness Sheikha Mozha Bint Nasser, who, if your audience isn't perhaps familiar with her and with her work, has been a long-standing advocate for education, and indeed was very much the driving force behind efforts at the UN which predate Wise by perhaps a decade or more, to include education amongst those activities that ought to be protected even in times of conflict. And so, I would say that, at that point, the world was obviously very different from what it is now. And it's incredible how almost a decade can change things so dramatically. But at the time, at least in the context of education was felt to be very much a local, even sort of, one might say parochial concern, and not something that, serious global policymakers needed to engage with.
It sounds like quite a task, right? It's an enormous task you take on, looking at the global state of education and trying to map out all these initiatives that are ongoing, but also the terrible things happening for people who are deprived of an education. And it's so much needed to have that conversation. So kudos to an initiative like Wise and the fact that it is there. But I do understand that it's like, wow, that's like a massive thing. And I think that also brings us to your challenges, because as your first challenge, you also said that there was such a broad mandate, and you write yourself, that is encapsulated in the tagline, building the future of education. So your first challenge was to distill this very broad aspiration into a set of tangible objectives and activities, and activities that would, of course, drive those objectives. So how long did it take you from joining in 2012 to clearly have those objectives on paper, and then also knowing how you're going to steer those objectives in, with the proper activities?
So getting stuff down on paper actually didn't take all that long. And in some respects, it was almost part of my job interview that I needed to sort of put together a very short, concept note as to what I would do with Wise as CEO. And there, in my mind, sort of looking around at at best practices and the kind of in this world of global fora, and then have some sort of programmatic dimension where you could, in a sense, put into practice in a small way, almost like a pilot type element, what you were arguing and advocating for, right? And so getting that down on paper and putting it across to stakeholders happened really, really quickly. I think what took a lot longer was actually then putting it into practice, bringing the right team on board to help implement, and programs as well. I mean, I was, again, very fortunate that I inherited some really good high-profile programs like the WISE Prize for Education, which is kind of a Nobel Prize, the first of its kind, to recognize educators and, in a sense, elevate them to the level of their peers in other domains of human endeavor and excellence. And then, of course, the WISE Awards, which recognized, specific innovations in education, kind of like the Oscars, if you will, of education. Again, I think, some of the first global awards and recognitions of their kind. And again, it's a testament to really the vision of Qatar Foundation and Her Highness to actually be pioneers in this space. So I inherited these programs, but then you say, okay, well, what more can I do? Because it's one thing to recognize and showcase, and it's another then to say, okay, I want to now try and influence and maybe shift the conversation towards an embrace of innovation, towards an appreciation that, education is an important driver, not just of, local economic development or national economic development, but it's also an important driver, say, of peace and a global sort of coming together. And that's when we had this approach, a little bit of, I would say trial and error. And I don't know what some of your other guests have been saying, but I think trial and error isn't given its due, in the business or skills world, because, I think, we like to think in terms of, oh yeah, there's a vision, and then there's a great strategy, and then there's flawless execution, right? Whereas I think as an entrepreneur yourself, that that's not how things play out, right? A lot of it is learning by doing, trying some things, they don't work, and then either, scrapping them or fine tuning them or rethinking the approach. So, I think we went through that entrepreneurial journey to a certain extent before finally, I think, I would say maybe 5 or even 6 years in, we kind of landed. Once we built certain capacities, we then landed on, okay, look, there's a certain set of evergreen topics in education that, we ought to have a view on, and we ought to try and advance through research and programming. And I can tell you what those are. I mean, one is education leadership. Like all domains, the quality of your education leaders on the ground, will by and large, I think, determine the quality of your outcomes and the capacity of a system to change, right? The second would be innovation for quality and access, meaning that, directing innovation at improving quality, improving access, again, critical. The third, which I think, Aldo, something about is education technology. We felt not enough was being done to really understand the potential and the impact that technology could have on education in a non-sensationalist way, right? Away from the kind of Silicon Valley mantra where, we're changing the world, without really thinking about, well, how are you changing the world? And is this really working, not working? And then the final two are learning ecosystems, meaning how do you mobilize a broader community of learning opportunities and integrate them into your education system writ large. And then the final, which is, I think, critically important, really learning sciences and well-being, meaning how do we take the knowledge that science is giving us, whether it's neuroscience or psychology or other domains of scientific discovery, how is that informing the way we teach and learn? And are we doing enough to integrate that into our systems? with a particular emphasis to making sure that the education process is also enhancing overall well-being. And it's not just about upskilling or training or cramming knowledge and facts. Important though all of that is, we really need to be thinking more broadly about enhancing the experience and the well-being of those who are going through an education system.
Mm-hmm. And so I just want to rewind a little, because now you basically described five.
I've jumped ahead.
No. That's very good, and it's extremely interesting. It's a bit of an academic exercise because I see like five pillars. I see dawning in front of me, and then every pillar basically has a specific activity aligned to it, I can imagine. So, am I correct to say?
And a research agenda, and
a research agenda.
And eventually a community of practice. And so it's, it's about, creating and encouraging ecosystems to evolve around these thematic areas.
Correct. And then so concretely out of these five, you have, for instance, in the education technology pillar, you have the WISE Accelerator.
Correct.
Right? So that's a concrete activity, and full disclosure, Teach Pitch was part of the second cohort of the WISE Accelerator, I believe, in 2015, which was an amazing experience. I'll get to that later because I don't want to only be talking about that. But could you very quickly take me through an activity for each of the pillars that were described? So which one do you have for leadership?
In education leadership, we have a program that we're running together with the Education Development Institute, which is another arm of Qatar Foundation, and also with the Ministry of Education in Qatar, which is called Empowering Leaders of Learning, ELL. And the idea here is to take, school principals, heads of department, and specifically equip them with the necessary skills to specifically manage change and to incorporate into their approach to delivering against learning outcomes, some of the best practices. So incorporating some of the trial and error, approaches, the best trial and error approaches into their daily practice.
And is it any industry?
I guess we borrow liberally from some of the best examples that come out of the tech world, teaching folks how to set up quick pilots and trials, how to assess and then refine results, and to do that in a way that doesn't interfere, or doesn't disrupt their day-to-day activities. But, and I think what's interesting about this program is that it's not just sitting people in a classroom and talking them through PowerPoints. What we do also is pair them up with coaches and mentors so that, they can, obviously carry the learning through to their day-to-day activities, which, by the way, in order for them to come to this program, they have to bring an issue that they're grappling with, supporting them in actually implementing and making real change happen in the classroom. The interesting thing here is that this program then also informs our research agenda, right? Because we, in interacting with school leaders and classroom leaders, we get a better understanding of what are the real challenges, to affecting change that positively impacts learning outcomes. So there's a self-reinforcing and, mutually beneficial cycle going on between the program and the research agenda.
Yeah.
And then to cap it off, because again, it's a good example, the leadership dimension is a good example of what we're trying to do with the other arenas. There's a global network called the All-In Network, which brings together, leadership practitioners along with folks who are trying to support these practitioners into a global network where, again, they share best practices, experiences. We're developing a repository of case studies around effective interventions, particularly effective interventions in the global South, where there isn't, a lot that's been written about, how do you apply some of these best practices in contexts outside of, North America and Western Europe. So I think if that could give you a good idea of how we synergize as much as possible between the global advocacy and network dimensions of WISE with the research, with the programmatic elements.
Yeah. With the people on the ground who can vouch for it, yes or no. Yeah. This is great because you basically describe an ideal triangle of people that you get around the table that need to look at education and that can basically, with their own set of expertise, can approach a topic from the right angle, but still drive it toward a concrete outcome. I think that's the beauty of looking at it. And then, of course, on a certain level that's applied to all 5 of the objectives. I can imagine, on each of its levels, so to say, that you basically see, okay, here's, for instance, in the education technology corner, I can imagine there are lots of people who are entrepreneurs, who are more in the kind of in the field looking at certain things, but it's always good for them to get some academic knowledge so they can basically gain that also via WISE, so to say. So that's the beauty of WISE, and we've experienced that firsthand. I've spoken to so many people from so many renowned research institutions at the WISE Summit, and it's always great to talk to them in a very informative setting, but also informal. You can just talk to one another. You can reach out to one another. You email each other afterwards. The conversation is ongoing. It's not just the event. There's more to it.
Yeah.
Maybe a bit of a tricky question, and you might not choose to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Mm-hmm. Which one of the 5 and which one of all the activities that you've deployed since 2012 is your favorite? Which one are you most proud of?
I think one is really putting WISE on the map as a kind of trusted interlocutor and partner for a very broad constituency of people engaged with education, from policymakers all the way, to educators and entrepreneurs, learners of all ages. That's what I'm most proud of. And maybe you can attest to this as well, Aldo. That's sort of encapsulated every time we have the WISE Summit. And I think the diversity of people that you have there, I think we're most proud of the fact that we are, and we try to be this inclusive forum that opens its doors to as many people as are willing and able to make a positive contribution in this space.
100%. And that's also what I really like about WISE, is that it's not grandstanding at all. I mean, yes, you're right. You have high profile guests, and it's an enormous, experience to see those people talk and to be in the presence of those people. And that's one thing. But then as someone who has experienced the WISE Summit now, I think 5 or 6 times, it's really an opportunity just to reach out to people and just to start a conversation. One of our previous guests was also Vicky Colbert, a former WISE Prize laureate. In the interview with her, I also recalled a moment whereby it was my very first summit, and I just, was there alone. I had no affiliation with WISE yet, other than I had heard of the event. And I just started talking to Vicky, and it was the most normal thing, that was there. The event is really there to connect, and the connection really happens because there are so many opportunities just to start talking to each other and to get into what they are doing to improve the state of education. And then the conversation is ongoing, and it doesn't matter who you are or where you're from. It's a really nice experience. And I really like that. Another thing I'd say is that the quality is very good. So you do expect certain deliverables. So the accelerator, there's a really concrete program that you take technology companies through. There is mentoring. There is a deliverable that is expected. And I think that also gives people something to look at and people something to look back to. So I also really like that. You do expect a little bit of input from everyone you take on. And I think for every pillar that might be different, but I do like that idea because it keeps people engaged. in whichever way they choose. So I can really vouch for what you just said. We're going to move on to your second challenge. And I think that second challenge has to do with, again, approaching something from a very global angle, whereas previously this was looked at in a very local way. And I think that there's a tension there that you say, yes, you can approach this globally, but then the solution isn't global. It's not, once you found kind of a solution for a problem on a global level, then good luck to you trying to implement that on a local level. And I think that tension remains to say, like, once there's a diagnosis, for instance, for training teachers in better understanding technology, which is very much what TeachPitch does, then we say, okay, yeah, we know how to do this in Albania or in Ecuador, but it doesn't mean we know how to do this for for teachers in Africa, so to say, because it's every time kind of a different solution, if you will. And your second challenge is very much around that. It's like, how can we continue to have a conversation on a global level, and you write, without losing the specificity and relevance for policymakers and practitioners who have to cater to a domestic audience. So how did you deal with that challenge? How do you basically, once people have had the summit and they're full of energy and they say, I know what to do, how do you then make sure that what is discussed becomes a reality when they take it back to their own country and to their own local solution?
I mean, that's a very sort of tough question that you're posing, Aldo, and I'm not sure I actually have an answer there, because part of what we try to do is inspire. And, by having the summit, by putting forward, the innovation awards every year, where we select 6 outstanding examples of innovation in education from around the world, across, all different kinds of domains. And of course, the Wise Prize laureates who really are, represent, if you will, the pinnacle of achievement in the education space. These folks are specifically there, and these examples are specifically there to inspire people and to make them believe that it is possible to make a significant difference to the world through education. Now, how then that gets translated, if you're a minister of education, of say my home country, Cyprus, say, and you're struggling with unions and, and the kind of the local politics of education, how do you then implement change? Well, I don't want to diminish the scale of that challenge by saying, well, just look at, what's been done here and there. I mean, that, yes, it's important to know that it's possible, but then how these policymakers then choose to translate that into their own, local context. There aren't, unfortunately, any silver bullets there. It is a hard slog. It is very often quite political. But I would say, look, the ingredients, are probably the same anywhere, meaning you need to identify from, within your teaching profession, if you will, in each country, who are going to be the champions of change, who are going to be the ones that, you need to think about empowering and giving them the tools and the autonomy to make change happen. It's not easy. I mean, system change in education is really hard. And that's why, to a certain extent, that's why, you and I are still here talking about these things, is because there isn't a quick solution that's, available for everyone to just, plug and play. But, I think, when I answered that question, I had in mind not so much, how do you translate global best practice into local solutions? I had more in mind the reverse almost. How do you take what was a local, seen as primarily a local concern, and elevate it into one that's globally significant?
Global way.
Yep. Yeah. So it's almost like how do you make the reverse journey, right?
The other way around.
How do you get business people interested in education, for example, right? How do you get them interested beyond complaining that they can't find, enough employees with the right skills? Because usually the interests of business kind of tends to stop there. It's just like complaining that, the quality of the graduates we're getting out of university isn't up to scratch, and we have all these, all these positions that go unfilled. And our approach into that specific example was really to engage with various economic forums and say, okay, look, guys, you're complaining about education. We're here to tell you that education is critically important, not just for your specific needs in the economy, but, important across a range of socioeconomic issues. And is there something you can do about it? Actually, there is. And there are examples, right? For, my, former employer and sort of corporate alma mater, McKinsey and Company incubated and launched a very successful program called Generations, which essentially sets up partnerships between corporate entities and education systems around the world so that these corporations can offer structured internship opportunities, apprenticeship opportunities that, both help to meet their corporate needs for a better quality of graduate, but also, helps, create, opportunities for primarily underprivileged kids to get a better education, much more geared towards helping them secure gainful employment in the future, right? So it was also about, prodding people to say, stop complaining, if you will, and do something about it, engage, right? Business is as much a stakeholder in education as anyone else.
I think that's what we need to see. This is also one of the reasons why, for instance, this podcast program of Teach Pitch is about life skills, and why I want to talk to not only people who make a difference in education, but skills are needed on every single level for whatever career you choose to pursue. And there's so much that can be learned from the skills of other people, and just listening in to how they achieved certain things, how they overcame certain challenges, where they looked, how they found solutions. We can learn a lot from each other. I think a lot more than we think. And I think that's also very good that WISE is there. I have two questions. And one is, of course, we would be amiss if we wouldn't talk about things going on in the world today. We've addressed, the fact that we are ready for a post-pandemic world. But the pandemic has, of course, changed, how we deal with education. And we've looked at many initiatives, and I know that you have as well during the pandemic, as to which solutions were found in certain countries, trying to amplify the examples that you found and try to, basically pass it on, among others, through the Wise Words podcast. What do you think will remain from those examples? What do you think we will take with us in a post-pandemic era?
Yeah, no, that again, that's a good question. And I think, the way that I look at it now is that the pandemic has thrown up an interesting paradox. On the one hand, it's demonstrated finally that we can do certain things with technology that were previously not really thought possible. I don't want to say that Zoom and the platform that we're on now, GoTo and others, I don't want to say that they saved education, but they certainly made it possible for education to continue. And so, it's clear to me that the pandemic acted as an accelerant for the adoption of and the integration of technology into education. How do we maintain some of it, where it makes sense and where we can see that the sort of delivery and quality of the learning is not just maintained but enhanced. Now, the paradox kicks in that, at the same time, the pandemic has also brought into stark relief just how important physical participation and presence in a classroom, in a school is beyond teaching and learning, right?
Yeah.
We kept saying, well, yes, you can deliver a lecture effectively on Zoom. Yes, you can probably have a good, seminar or workshop on GoTo or on, Microsoft Teams or whatnot, right? But what about the socialization aspects?
Yeah.
What about, the casual conversations, in the corridor or, around the canteen table or in the playground? What about those interactions?
Yeah.
How invaluable those interactions are, in fact, in the overall process of learning, how to be a social being, right?
Yeah.
Which is what humans,
what we all are. Yeah. Yeah.
Right. All of these, I think are, making people realize that school, the physical, place is important for a whole lot more than just delivering lessons.
100%.
And so I think the challenge going forward is, how do you reconcile these two? We all keep saying, okay, let's build back better. Okay, well, what does that mean and what does that look like?
Yeah, that's a lot to think about what you just said. And it's very much, it's kind of, we've been in opposite worlds, right? So we've been in the world of technology only all of a sudden, and then we see that technology is there. It's definitely an aid, but it isn't all that. Before the pandemic hit, it was more in the opposite direction. I remember with TeachPitch, people didn't always recognize the necessity of technology, even though they could improve a lot by using technology, by adopting technology to the fullest. There has always been a challenge, and I speak from experience here, from if you create a technology and you say, well, it's really going to work, and why don't you use it to schools and institutions and teachers and whatever more, there was some skepticism because they said, no, that's not what's going to work, and it isn't going to help me and whatever more. Then all of a sudden the pandemic hits and teachers and students have no choice. They need to resort to technology. And then they see the upside of using technology. But of course, I fully acknowledge that a technology-only situation isn't optimal. It was never meant as something like that. So it always needs to balance out a little bit. It seems to see, okay, what's the best point for technology and the schools of brick and mortar to kind of work together, of people being present in the same room, of still having those social interactions and being able to build on that, of having a normal teacher-student interaction, face-to-face, in person, which we all need. And you're very right. We're all humans at the end of the day. So yeah, it's very interesting to see how that plays out.
It would just be remiss of me, and given that this is the Teach Pitch podcast, if I didn't mention the one constant, and that's good teachers. Of course, along with parents who have had to really step up and perform some of the roles that teachers would have done had they been able to be physically present. But, what an amazing role, committed teachers have continued to play, even during these tough times, often going, above and beyond what's expected of them. I mean, stories of, in the Amazonas in Brazil, of teachers traveling for, half a day by boat to go and deliver lesson plans, physical lesson plans. Mm-hmm. And, similar stories coming out of India, right? Teachers calling in to check up on students to see how they're doing.
Yeah, most definitely. I want to go to the Y Summit of this year, 2021. Yeah. The theme was Generation Unmute. If you would permit me, I would like to draw a small parallel here of what's going on in the world today, and that's Afghanistan. And so now with the United States, that was announced, I believe, last night or early this morning, that the United States, they've left Afghanistan. Malala Yousafzai has been very critical, of course, of the United States leaving, and said, well, this is going to be detrimental for the state of education in Afghanistan, and more particularly in education for girls and women. I know it's very difficult, and it's very difficult to talk about how things are going to develop. But I do feel we don't want to be muted here, and we want to make sure that girls and women in Afghanistan are not muted either. What would be your response to that? And more particularly, looking at the summit, what would be your take on this, if anything?
Yeah. I mean, where to begin, right? Clearly, what is unfolding at the moment in Afghanistan is a tragedy. There's no two ways about it. It's a tragedy, though, that has been years, if not decades, in the making. And I think the more pertinent question is, okay, what happens now? And how does the international community and NGOs and others rally specifically for education to ensure that women and girls in particular continue to receive and avail themselves of quality education. I wish I had an answer to what would work in this environment. I don't have a ready answer. What I'm pretty sure is not going to help is grandstanding and issuing sort of admonitions and, in a sense, stating the obvious, because, at the end of the day, you and I don't need to convince each other that educating women and girls is a moral obligation and it's the right thing to do. And I mean, it's just, I wouldn't even know what to say about something like that without sounding absolutely flippant, right? Mm-hmm. But I think continuing to quietly advocate, to find, opportunities to support, organizations who are, working on the ground in Afghanistan. And of course, in the case of WISE, we have our 2015 WISE Prize laureate, Sheikha Yaqubi, the Afghan Institute of Learning, and her US-based charity Creating Hope International, which is very closely aligned with the Afghan Institute of Learning. Sheikha has been working from, the early 90s to advance the cause of women's education in Afghanistan. And she worked through the period of the first Taliban regime. And she has, publicly said she will continue working under this current regime as well to advance the cause for, women and girls education. And so, my, I suppose, advice would be to look for organizations like the Afghan Institute of Learning who have experience on the ground and support them.
Yeah, thanks. That's a very good suggestion. We'll be sure also to include the link to the Afghan Institute of Learning and the great work of Sheikha Yaqubi in the show notes of this interview.
Yeah.
And I think it's great that WISE is a platform where people can discuss this, right? Can discuss these concerns and support wherever we can.
Yeah. No, of course.
So that we're not just bystanders to this happening. I'd like to move on to your third challenge, which is now we've discussed a lot. We've been very academic in our approach and kind of looked at, maybe a little abstract in terms of discussing these pillars and then the specific programs and kind of all the activities that came out of that. And your third challenge is basically, I think, a logical challenge, because you as WISE in and of itself as a social enterprise is delivering to a public good, and therefore you're continuously challenged to measure and quantify its impact, which I can imagine is a difficult one. How did you go about putting the impact down? What was your biggest challenge in showing, okay, here's the impact of actually what we've done this summit. We have had this many guests. Here are the takeaways. Here are, the deliverables of our program, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. How are you invested in impact, and how do you measure it?
Yeah. I mean, that's a really good way of framing it, Aldo. And I don't have a ready answer, because it's something that we're still struggling with. And we're struggling, I struggle with it personally at sort of two levels. One is I don't like to overstate a case. And I certainly don't like to take any credit for the work of others. And so at Wise, we try to be very, very careful to say, so for example, our, laureates and our, award winners and our accelerator graduates, between them, they're, responsible for supporting, millions of, educators and learners and families, around the world. Now, I couldn't possibly, as Wise, how much credit do I take for working with these organizations, right? So I think what we've tried to do is, as much as possible, be absolutely fact-based about what we say to the world in terms of our impact, right? So we will say, just in terms of this example, we will say that our programs have, benefited X number of individuals and organizations. And these are people that we've had direct contact with through our programs. And then we'll say, and collectively, those organizations serve this many beneficiaries according to their reporting, right? And then people can investigate and can dig further and say, okay, well, what did you do? And then, we have all the data there, and we say, okay, well, these are recognition programs, the awards, the prize, these are capacity building programs, accelerator, some of the leadership programs that we spoke about earlier, and so on and so forth, right? So, just be very, very clear, factual in our communication about what we do with whom, and, how then that, cascades to more and more people.
Yeah.
So that's one dimension. The other is to say, okay, well, who are the stakeholders here? I mean, the one stakeholder, of course, is the community that we serve, the organizations such as, Teach Pitch that we've interacted with and supported. The other, of course, is, our paymasters, right? Qatar Foundation and the state of Qatar, that are, supply the bulk of the funding for Wise. So what's in it for them, so to speak? And here we've been using metrics that have to do with, I hate to use the term soft power, but I can't think of a better one right now. Mm-hmm. And that is to say, here's the sort of the positive reputational effect and influence that, a country or a large organization can gain by doing good works and by supporting good works. And there we had we developed a sort of interesting metric where we looked at all the publicity that Wise had generated across global media and then tried to turn that into advertising dollars. And say, if you wanted to say, okay, so to say Wise, over its 10-year history, generated something like 26,000, articles and mentions in newspapers. And then we tried to sort of say, okay, if you take a typical article and, let's say the equivalent would be a quarter-page ad in a newspaper, right? What would that be in dollar terms? And we took some very, very, very conservative assumptions, meaning that I didn't take a quarter-page ad in the New York Times as my benchmark. Mm-hmm. I went to the opposite end of the scale and said, okay, what's a quarter-page ad in a local publication in a magazine and, in the African continent, say, mm-hmm. right? What would that cost me? And, we took that as the benchmark and then, it gives you quite a significant number in terms of advertising spend. But again, mm-hmm. it goes back to the point, okay, be transparent about what you're measuring and how you're measuring it.
No, but first of all, I think you've taken a very neutral, modest approach to impact numbers in general. I know that the people of the accelerator, they contact us every year and ask how we've been doing, and then I ask a few questions and we try to give them those numbers just to keep track of things. And I think that's also important, keeping track of things, seeing how things evolve.
Yeah, of course.
At no point, from speaking from our end, we've ever thought, oh, you're going to claim those numbers as if you're theirs. But it's good to see the progress of organizations that you've supported. Equally so, I think it's also good to see if organizations aren't doing so well that you continue to be a connector, because maybe there are other things that you could help with, or you have such a great Rolodex of people that you know, and maybe you could help out, if things aren't going well or on any other level. So I think it's good. It's good to discuss impact. It's good to discuss, okay, how many people are we helping? How many students are effectively looking at better learning outcomes, etc. And I think there's a great role there for WISE, and you have taken up that role, and I hope you will continue to do so. So thanks for discussing your challenges, and we could talk for many, many more hours about them because they're quite big, because WISE is such a big event, and so many people have been involved with WISE to date. I want to move on to our two very last questions, Stavros, at the very end of our interview. I've asked you these questions before, so this is the third time I'm going to ask you them.
Yeah.
One of them is about reading. What are you currently reading, and what would you recommend to our audience for them to read?
So, I'm going to give you a different answer because I'm not reading the same book that I was 3 months ago. And it's interesting because it kind of ties into the question about events in Afghanistan. And I'm actually reading, I have a passion for history. I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but the book I'm reading at the moment is called The Anarchy, and it's by William Dalrymple, the British historian who has written a lot about Mughal India, which includes, of course, Afghanistan as well. So The Anarchy is really the history of the takeover of India by the British East India Company, and the chaos that India was going through during the time. Not all of it, by the way, just in the interest of historical fairness, it was not all caused by the British East India Company, although they certainly capitalized on the chaos, and they sort of mounted the most audacious corporate takeover of an empire, essentially, in the history of man. And why it's sort of interesting, from my standpoint, is that the same author has also written another book called Return of the King, which is about the first Anglo-Afghan war and the installation by the British at the time of a king in Afghanistan.
When is this?
It was the 19th century. So I forget the precise dates, but it would have been in the 1860s or 70s, thereabouts. Forgive me if I'm making a mistake here, and there are just some, very interesting parallels with, obviously that the first Anglo-Afghan war did not end well. And there are sort of very interesting parallels, unfortunately with what's happening today, which, some might say begs the question, why do we persistently fail to learn from history? And I know you had a historian on the podcast, and I haven't listened to that episode yet, but I will. It just interesting to me to see that history maybe doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly echoes. Yeah. And we still have not grasped that fact as humanity writ large. So I would highly recommend these
Anarchy
books.
Yeah.
So The Anarchy and The Return of the King, both by William Dalrymple. So,
thanks so much. Those are great recommendations. I will definitely take a look at them and read them. And then the very last question, Stavros. For many of my guests, they don't have a podcast program, but you do. So who is on your wish list for kind of who would you like to talk to? If we could organize inviting one guest for you, who you could talk to for wise words, then who would that be?
Wow. I would love to get a well-known popular historian on the podcast. So, someone like, William Dalrymple or Tom Holland is another historian I read and admire. Neil Ferguson as well. I've read some of his books. Mary Beard, of course, who writes about Rome, ancient Rome. So it's a very strong British bias.
Yeah.
And British historians in particular is.
Yeah. I think in both your answers, and you said it before, you basically say there's a lot more that we can learn from history. We're thinking we're completely new to the world, and this is the first time we've encountered this situation. But in many cases,
it's not.
Maybe, it's not. It's not. It has been done before. Yeah. We're not as unique as we think. Yeah.
Yeah. It's the arrogance of modernity to think that the people in the past didn't know anything. And, it cuts both ways. Either we tend to over revere the past.
Yeah.
And there are certain sort of societies and individuals that look at the past with rose-tinted glasses.
Yeah.
But then equally, there's the other extreme tendency, which is to ignore it and say, oh, those guys were semi-illiterate, barbarians by comparison, and what did they know?
Yeah.
As always, there's a happy medium.
Yeah. Yeah.
And recognizing that the present is an accumulation of the past.
Yeah. Most definitely. Such wisdom. Thank you so much, Stavros, for this interview. If you want to know more about WISE, I suggest you go to its website, which is wise-qatar.org, and check out Wise Words, which is the great podcast program of the WISE initiative, as well as the upcoming summit, which will take place on the 7th to the 9th of December of this year. And I think there's lots that you can take a look at, lots that you can follow around that summit. So those would be most definitely things that I would recommend, but there's a lot more to the website. So just go to the website in its entirety and find out more about the World Innovation Summit for Education. Stavros, I'd like to thank you very much for this interview. I'd also like to thank you for all the support that you've given to TeachPitch as the CEO of WISE. Let's definitely keep in touch. Come back anytime. It's been a great pleasure having you. Thank you so much, Stavros Yiannouka.
It's always a pleasure talking to you, Aldo, and it's no surprise that I was, willing to come back for a third take because I enjoyed each and every conversation and happy to do it.
Thanks so much. If you liked this episode of the TeachPitch podcast, then it would mean the absolute world if you could share it with your friends and or give it a short review on your preferred podcast platform. The more you share your ideas about these interviews, the more people will find out about them. So do let us know what you think. We'd be very, very grateful.
Special thanks to Kevin MacLeod for our beautiful theme music, Le Grand Chase. This podcast was produced and edited by Natalie Piles. Project coordination by Inva Cheney.